We can learn from history or we can also repeat it. Now, when Hamas attacked Israel the first week of October of 2023, a lot of people of the modern generation, those under 35, had no idea the significance of that date. Well, 50 years before, not say it was something similar, but Israel was attacked by outside forces and it led to what was called the Yom Kippur War, also known as the Ramadan War, the October War, the 73 Arab-Israeli War, and the Fourth Arab-Israeli War was an armed conflict fought between October 6th and 25th, 73, between Israel and a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria, as well as troops from 10 other countries. The majority of combat between the two sides took place in the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. Both were occupied by Israel in the 67 war, with some fighting in African Egypt and northern Israel. Egypt's initial objective in the war was to seize a foothold on the eastern bank of the Suez Canal and subsequently leverage these gains to negotiate the return of the rest of the Israeli-occupied Sinai. Began on October 6th when the Arab coalition jointly launched a surprise attack against Israel on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, which had occurred during the 10th day of the Islamic holy month of Ramadan in that year. Following the outbreak of hostilities, both the states and the Soviet Union initiated massive resupply efforts to their allies, Israel and Arab states respectively, during the war, which led to a confrontation between the two nuclear-armed superpowers. Fighting commenced when Egyptian and Syrian troops crossed their corresponding ceasefire lines with Israel and entered the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal in Operation Badr and advanced into the Sinai Peninsula. The Syrians launched a coordinated attack in the Golan Heights to coincide with the Egyptian offensive and initially made gains into Israeli-held territory. After 3 days of heavy fighting, Israel halted the Egyptian offensive, resulting in a military stalemate on that front, and pushed the Syrians back to pre-war ceasefire lines. The Israeli military then launched a 4-day-long counteroffensive deep into Syria, which was broadcast heavy on CBC and other channels in that October. And within a week, Israeli artillery began to shell the outskirts of the Syrian capital of Damascus. Egyptian forces, meanwhile, pushed for 2 strategic mountain passes deeper within the Sinai Peninsula, but were repulsed, and Israeli forces counterattacked by crossing the Suez Canal into Egypt and advancing towards Suez City. On October 22nd, initial ceasefire brokered by the UN unraveled, with each side blaming the other for the breach. By October 24th, the Israelis had improved their positions considerably and completed their encirclement of the Egyptian Third Army in Suez City, bringing them within 62 miles of the Egyptian capital of Cairo. This development led to dangerously heightened tensions between the states and the Soviet Union, and a second ceasefire was imposed cooperatively on October 25th to officially end the war. Now, the Yom Kippur War had far-reaching implications. The Arab world had experienced humiliation in a lopsided rout of the Egyptian-Syrian-Jordanian alliance in 67, but felt psychologically vindicated by early successes in the 73 conflict. The Israelis recognized that, despite the impressive operational and tactical achievements on the battlefield, there was no guarantee they would always dominate the Arab states militarily, as they had done consistently throughout the First, Second, and Third Arab-Israeli wars. These changes paved the way for the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. At the 78 Camp David Accords that followed the war, Israel returned the entire Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, which led to the subsequent 1979 Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, marking the first instance that an Arab country recognized Israel as a legitimate state. Following the achievement of peace with Israel, Egypt continued to drift away from the Soviet Union and eventually left the Soviet sphere of influence entirely. Now, just a recap. The conflict lasted approximately 19 days. Location was the Golan Heights, the Sinai, Suez Canal, both banks, and surrounding regions. The Israeli victory also led to the Egyptian forces to occupy the eastern bank of the Suez, with the exception of the Israeli crossing point near the Dever Sowar air base. Israeli forces occupied 620 square miles of territory on the southwestern coast of the Suez Canal, within 60 miles of the Egyptian capital of Cairo, and encircled an Egyptian enclave on its eastern bank. Israeli forces occupied 193 square miles of the Syrian Bashan region on top of the Golan Heights, bringing them within 20 miles of Damascus. Now, Israel battled forces from Egypt and Syria, as well as those from Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Jordan, Iraq, Libya, Kuwait, Tunisia, Morocco, Cuba, long way from home, and North Korea. Now, the strength of the forces were quite interesting. Israel had nearly 415,000 troops, 1,700 tanks, 3,000 armored carriers, 945 artillery units, and 440 combat aircraft. Egypt had close to 800,000 troops, while Syria had 150,000. Saudi Arabia had 23,000, where 3,000 crossed. Morocco had 6,500. Cuba had close to 1,000. Now, the grand total of troops available to the Arab alliance included more than 1 million troops, 3,600 tanks, 4,000 armored carriers, 1,720 artillery units, 452 combat aircraft, 140 helicopters, 104 naval vessels, and 150 surface-to-air batteries. Now, losses on and casualties on both sides. Israelis, 2,800 dead, about 9,000 wounded, 293 captured, 400 tanks destroyed, 663 damaged or captured, 407 armored vehicles destroyed or captured, and approximately 387 aircraft destroyed. Egypt lost 15,000 dead, 8,300 captured. Syria lost 3,500, 392 captured. Morocco had 6 captured. Iraq, 278 dead, nearly 1,000 wounded, 13 captured. Cuba lost 180 soldiers, 250 wounded. And Jordan had 23 dead, 77 wounded. Now, rough numbers, 18,500 dead, 35,000 wounded, 8,800 captured, 2,300 tanks destroyed, 514 aircraft destroyed, and 19 naval vessels sunk. So if anybody wants some more information on the war, obviously CBC Archives, PBS, BBC. It's quite interesting too. The war was considered a nightly thing in 1973 when I was 8 years old that year. A lot of people felt by Halloween we could have World War III if it went the wrong way. But the Israeli army and the troops of the Arab and affiliated countries, like I said, I don't really think they knew what was going to happen at the end. It started by the Arabs, but the problem is with the Israelis, what happened in 67 after it happened in Munich in 72, they were well prepared. But I think militarily, Soviet Union also lost the war because they lost the support of Egypt, because eventually Sadat, who was part of the Arab forces there, led Egypt in that peace accord. Unfortunately, he was assassinated because of it. But ladies and gentlemen, if you're a pro-Palestinian person or pro-Israeli, I want you to look at both sides for a second. The 73 war, there's a lot of ramifications from this. But the idea is, ladies and gentlemen, Israel, for those wars against the Arab nations or affiliated states, it didn't end up good for the Arabs. And the fact is, what Hamas is doing as a terrorist organization, it's like the old PLO. And I mean, if you want to beat Israel in any battle, you have to put up or shut up. Israel had kicked the arse of the Arab countries for so many times it became a joke. And the great Moshe Dayan said that specifically, if you cross that line, he said you will cross the line. And Golda Meir was there and the different forces. But ladies and gentlemen, like I said, you could be a 20-year-old person listening to this podcast and have no idea of this war. So read up on the 4 Arab-Israeli wars, the Suez Crisis, as we call it, the 67 campaign, talking about the land exchanges and different stuff. Know your history before you take a side. Any war is tragedy. The Israelis that were kidnapped, the Palestinians were bombed. Obviously, a very dense part of the world. But look at both sides, because why in the name of God would Israel give up their arms after the Holocaust? It was not going to happen. And not saying the Arab countries were stupid at the time, but put it all together, you got to negotiate peace when you have no chance for victory. What are the chances of the Arab countries winning that war in 73? 10%, 20%? Unless you're using nuclear weapons, which both sides didn't want to use. The Soviet Union was starting to, kind of fade out a little bit too. Like monetarily, they were stretched too much in that disaster in Afghanistan. So, ladies and gentlemen, read history, look at history. Don't listen to TikTok. Don't listen to me. Read for yourself on reliable sources, either encyclopedias or, different entries for Sadat's life, Moshe Dayan, the Israeli conflict. You got to understand, Just because you see the Palestinian side, you're not seeing the whole story. You must inform yourself. So, ladies and gentlemen, I wish everybody luck. Hopefully, the exchange will continue of the prisoners, and I don't think in 2023 it had as much as negative ramifications as 67 and 73 because, by the way, you find that strange that Putin's not saying much about this conflict? When is the last time he stated anything about what's going on? Interesting. Think about that for a second. What do you call no noise means there's nothing you can do really, because it's all wait and see. It's the way it goes. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you like what we're doing here with our historical podcast, let us know with a like, comment, subscribe, or share. Bye.